The year is 1889. The sun over Lone Mesa, New Mexico, was not a gentle thing. It was a hammer, beating down on the red dust until the heat shimmered up in waves, blurring the hard edges of the world. Dust was the town's most plentiful commodity. It coated the unpainted planks of the general store, settled in the bottom of empty glasses at Hattie's saloon, and worked its way into the lungs of every man, woman, and horse. Lone Mesa was a town clinging to the edge of the desert, a place of second chances and last resorts, held together by stubbornness and the two gleaming steel rails of the new railroad that cut through the landscape like a fresh scar. The law here was thin, stretched taut like old leather, and a man's principles were often the only real thing he had to his name. Jonah Hale had his principles. They were what kept him mending the fence line of the small parcel of land he worked, a few miles from the town's clamor. At 35, he moved with a deliberate economy of motion that spoke of a life spent in open, dangerous spaces. His past as a cavalry scout was something he rarely spoke of, but it lived in the quiet watchfulness of his gray eyes and the persistent ache in his left shoulder, a souvenir from a skirmish he'd rather forget. Now, his days were measured by the sun's arc and the simple, honest work of his hands, gentling horses and patching up the world one fence post at a time. He preferred the company of horses to men. They were less likely to lie. He sought nothing more than the quiet life he was building, a life where trouble rode on by without stopping. He was hammering a loose post into place when the stagecoach rattled past on the main trail, a plume of ochre dust trailing it like a phantom. It was an hour behind schedule, its horses lathered and tired. Jonah paused, leaning on the post driver, and watched it lumber toward town. Coaches brought news, supplies, and, more often than not, complications. As the dust began to settle, he saw a woman step out. She was not what he expected, dressed in a practical but well-kept traveling dress of dark blue. She seemed to carry a stillness with her that defied the town's raw energy. She wasn't a saloon girl, nor a weary homesteader's wife. There was an educated set to her shoulders, a firmness in the way she stood her ground as the wind whipped strands of her brown hair from beneath her bonnet. This was Marin Calloway, though Jonah didn't know her name yet. At 26, her face held the quiet grief of a new widow, a loss to the pox that had swept through St. Louis and taken her husband. But her eyes, clear and direct, held a formidable intelligence. She was a woman who had learned to be resilient because the world had given her no other choice. Jonah finished his work and turned his horse, Calico, back toward his cabin. He had no business with newcomers, but as he crested a small rise overlooking the trail that branched off toward the valley's scattered homesteads, he saw her again. She was no longer in the stagecoach but on the buckboard of a hired wagon, piled high with her belongings. Two large trunks, one clearly filled with books and teaching slates, were lashed down behind her, and blocking her path were 4 riders. They wore dusty trail clothes, their faces obscured by red bandanas pulled up to their eyes. Not common bandits. They sat their horses with a lazy arrogance that suggested they felt they owned the road. Jonah reined in Calico behind a cluster of mesquite, his scout's instincts kicking in. He didn't want this trouble, but his eyes were fixed on the scene. The lead rider, a burly man with a guttural voice, tipped his hat in a mockery of politeness. "Ma'am, just a routine patrol. Name's Baxter Colt. We're making sure no undesirables are bringing trouble into this valley." Marin Calloway sat ramrod straight. "I assure you, I am not trouble. I'm the new teacher, hired by several of the local families. Now, if you'll excuse me." Colt chuckled, a gravelly sound. "A teacher? You say that's a noble profession. All those books and papers must be heavy. We'd be happy to inspect your cargo, make sure everything's in order." His eyes weren't on the books. They were on a specific leather-bound trunk at the back. "My papers are my private business," Marin said, her voice steady, betraying none of the fear that must have been churning inside her. "You have no authority to inspect anything?" "Oh, we have authority," another rider sneered. shifting his weight in the saddle. A pistol grip was visible at his hip, the authority of concerned citizens. This was wrong. Jonah felt it in the pit of his stomach. It was the kind of wrongness that festered in places like Lone Mesa, where a man with enough money could invent his own law. He knew of Baxter Colt, a hard case who worked odd jobs for the railroad, mostly jobs that involved persuasion of the less than gentle kind. And the railroad meant Silas Varn, a man who cast a shadow long enough to cover the entire county. Jonah nudged Calico forward, leaving the cover of the mesquite. He didn't charge in. He simply walked his horse onto the trail, his approach quiet and unassuming. The four riders tensed, their hands moving instinctively toward their belts. "Afternoon, Baxter," Jonah said, his voice even. He kept his hands in plain sight, resting on his saddle horn. Colt's eyes narrowed. "Hail. This ain't your concern, just conducting a citizen's toll." "Looks more like you're troubling the lady," Jonah replied, his gaze shifting from Colt to Marin and back again. He saw the flicker of fight in her eyes, the refusal to be cowed. "Last I heard, the only law in this county wears a star, and you ain't wearing one." A tense silence hung in the air, thick as the dust. Colt knew Jonah's reputation. Hale wasn't a gunslinger looking for a name. He was a man who had survived things Colt's thugs only heard stories about. Starting a fight with him was a risk with little reward. "We're just having a look," Colt insisted. But the bluster was gone from his voice. One of his men, impatient, dismounted and strode toward the wagon. "I said my papers are private." Marin's voice cracked like a whip. The man ignored her, grabbing at the leather trunk. In his haste, he fumbled the latch. The trunk fell from the wagon bed, hitting the ground with a heavy thud and bursting open. A cascade of documents, deeds, letters, legal forms spilled into the red dirt. The wind caught them immediately, scattering them like dry leaves. Chaos erupted. Colt's men scrambled to grab the papers, cursing as the wind played tricks on them. Marin cried out in protest, trying to get down from the wagon. Jonah saw his opening. He urged Calico forward, placing himself between Marin and the men. "That's enough," he said, his voice low and hard now. "You've made your point. Now ride on." Colt saw his men had gathered most of the important-looking documents. He had what Varn had sent him for, holding up a sheaf of papers. He gave Jonah a venomous glare. "This ain't over. Hail!" He and his men mounted up and spurred their horses down the trail, leaving Marin amidst the wreckage of her belongings. A few stray papers fluttered weakly in the dust. One, heavier than the others, had been caught on a sagebrush. Jonah dismounted, the ache in his shoulder flaring with the sudden tension. He walked over to Marin, who was now on her knees, desperately trying to salvage what was left. Her composure had finally broken, and her hands trembled as she smoothed out a creased letter. "Are you all right, ma'am?" he asked softly. She looked up, her eyes bright with unshed tears of frustration and fury. "They took everything, my husband's letters, the school charters, everything." She swallowed hard, forcing the composure back into place. "Thank you for your help, Mr. Hale, Jonah Hale." He bent down and carefully untangled the paper from the sagebrush. It wasn't a letter. It was a hand-drawn map, rendered on thick vellum, but it was torn. Only the upper half remained, showing the familiar contours of the nearby mesas and a winding creek bed. A small, carefully inked circle was marked with the words Cottonwood Sprar. The rest was gone. He handed it to her. "This looks important." Her fingers closed around it like a lifeline. She stared at the torn edge, a deep line forming between her brows. For a moment, she seemed to be debating with herself. The fear of being a woman alone in a strange, hostile town warred with the need for an ally. The need won. They weren't just after-school papers. "Mr. Hale," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "My husband, before he passed, he bought the deed to this land, to the water rights." Her eyes lifted from the map to meet his, and in them, he saw the full, unvarnished truth of her predicament. That map, it shows the location of Cottonwood Spring. According to the deed they stole, it belongs to me. Jonah's blood ran cold. Cottonwood Spring was the only reliable water source in the entire valley, the lifeblood for every small rancher and farmer trying to scratch a living from this unforgiving land. And Silas Varn wanted it. He needed it to feed his steam engines and to hold a monopoly that would allow him to squeeze every last homesteader until they sold their land to him for pennies on the dollar. This woman wasn't just a poor school teacher. She was the one person standing in Varn's way. He looked from her determined, dust-streaked face to the torn map in her hand. He thought of the quiet life he wanted, the peace he had worked so hard to find. He could see it all slipping away, caught in the current of this woman's fight. He had wanted to avoid trouble, but trouble had just been robbed on the road in broad daylight. And he had intervened. "Looks like you've brought more than books to Lone Mesa, Mrs. Calloway," he said, his voice grim. She straightened her spine, clutching the tattered piece of her inheritance. "I've brought a claim," she corrected him, her voice ringing with a strength that the wind couldn't carry away, "and I intend to see it honored." The sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. The dust settled, but the air was still charged. Jonah looked at Marin Calloway, then at the distant railroad tracks that gleamed like a snake in the fading light. The old ache in his shoulder pulsed, a dull throb that always seemed to warn him when a storm was on its way. This one, he reckoned, was going to be a bad one. Jonah helped Marin gather what little the wind and Baxter Colt's men had left behind. He loaded her trunks onto his own wagon and escorted her not to a remote homestead, but to the Widow Johnson's boarding house at the edge of town, the only respectable lodging for a single woman in Lone Mesa. The silence between them was heavy, filled with the unspoken reality of her situation. He left her on the porch with a curt nod, the weight of her fight settling on his shoulders like a shroud. He wanted no part of it. Yet by standing up to Colt, he had already chosen a side. The next morning, Marin did not unpack her teaching slates. Instead, she walked with quiet purpose to the dusty county clerk's office, a small room attached to the sheriff's building. The clerk, a man named Eustace Miller with a green eye shade and ink-stained fingers, was a creature of ledgers and laws. He listened to her story, his expression impassive, and after a lengthy search through a massive, leather-bound book of county statutes, he found the page he was looking for. He ran a bony finger along the script. "Well, Mrs. Calloway, you've got a problem," he stated, his voice devoid of sympathy. "Statute 7, subsection B, a water claim of this nature, inherited or purchased, must be validated by a residing head of household." He peered at her over his spectacles. "A man. That is, or," he continued, turning the book for her to see, "a legally married couple, residing together on or near the property in question." The ink on the page seemed to mock her. All her education, her resilience, her rightful claim invalidated by the simple fact of her gender. She was a widow, a solitary woman. In the eyes of the law of Lone Mesa, she was incomplete. She had the right, but not the standing to claim it. That afternoon, she found Jonah mending a bridle in his barn. The air smelled of leather, hay, and the clean scent of the horse liniment he was rubbing into the worn straps. He worked with a focused calm, his large hands surprisingly deft. He looked up as her shadow fell across the doorway. "Mr. Hale," she began, her voice formal, betraying none of the turmoil inside her. "Ma'am, he didn't stop his work. I've been to the county clerk. It seems my claim is complicated." She explained the statute, her words precise and clipped. "I cannot file the claim as a single woman. Silas Varn's lawyers will have it thrown out before the ink is dry." Jonah set the bridle down, finally giving her his full attention. He saw the calculated resolve in her eyes, and a knot of apprehension tightened in his gut. He knew what was coming before she said it. The law provides one other option, she said, her gaze unwavering. A legally married couple. He stared at her, the silence stretching between them. The idea was absurd, a marriage. To this stranger, he, who had sought nothing but solitude, was being asked to tie himself to the very center of the trouble he had spent years avoiding. "You're proposing we get married," he said flatly. It wasn't a question. "I am proposing a business arrangement," she corrected him, her chin lifting a fraction. "A temporary contract, a marriage in name only. It would give my claim legal standing. It would protect Cottonwood Spring not just for me, but for every small rancher in this valley who depends on it. Once the claim is secure and legally recorded, we can have it annulled, quietly. No one need be the wiser about the particulars." He turned away, picking up the bridle again. Though his hands were still, he thought of the homesteaders he knew, the Garcias, the Millers, the old man Peterson, all of whom would be ruined if Varn damned that spring. He thought of the raw greed he'd seen in Baxter Colt's eyes. This wasn't just Marin's fight anymore. Varn wouldn't stop with the water. He wanted the whole valley. Jonah's quiet piece of it included. "People will talk," he said, his voice rough. "Let them," Marin countered. "They are already talking. A widow arriving alone with a land claim is a story. A newly married couple settling down is just life. It is the safer narrative." He weighed the choices. Walk away and watch Varn choke the life out of the valley, or step into a lie, a pretense, and invite a world of trouble to his doorstep. His principles, the ones that had guided him since he'd left the army, were clear. You don't stand by while a bully takes what isn't his, and you don't let your neighbors thirst. "All right, Mrs. Calloway," he said, turning back to face her. The decision felt like stepping off a cliff. "I'll do it." A flicker of relief, so profound it was almost pain, crossed her face before she masked it. "Thank you, Mr. Hale." "If we're to be married," he said gruffly, "you should call me Jonah." The wedding was as stark as the landscape. It took place 2 days later in the simple, unadorned wooden church. The only light came from the dusty shafts of sun filtering through the tall windows. Reverend Abner Pike, a man whose piety always seemed to be at war with a deep-seated ambition, presided over the ceremony. His words about holy matrimony rang hollow in the nearly empty nave. Their only witness was Deputy Ruth Navarro, a woman of Mexican heritage in her early 30s. She wore her badge on a leather vest and her pistol with an ease that spoke of competence. Her dark, intelligent eyes missed nothing. She had been the one to file the report on the robbery, and she understood the town's power dynamics better than anyone. As she signed the marriage certificate as a witness, she gave them both a long, searching look. It wasn't a look of judgment, but of weary acknowledgement. She'd seen all kinds of desperate measures taken in the name of survival. When the Reverend pronounced them man and wife, there was no kiss, only a brief, awkward handshake. Jonah's calloused palm enveloped Marin's smaller, softer one. It was the first time they had touched. The contact was like a spark on dry tinder, a sudden, unexpected jolt that made them both pull away a second too quickly. They were partners in a legal fiction, but their bodies had just registered a different kind of truth. The ink on the certificate was barely dry when Silas Varn made his first move. He didn't send Baxter Colt. He sent something far more dangerous, a lawyer from Santa Fe named Fletcher, dressed in a fine wool suit that seemed to repel the town's dust. Fletcher found Jonah and Marin as they were loading her belongings to move them to his cabin. "Mr. and Mrs. Hale," Fletcher began, his smile thin and predatory. "Congratulations on your sudden nuptials. A whirlwind romance, I presume." "Our business is our own," Jonah said, stepping between Fletcher and Marin. "But of course," the lawyer purred, "it's just that your business has suddenly become entwined with Mr. Varn's interests. He finds the timing of your union, coinciding so perfectly with this spurious water claim, to be highly suspect. He is prepared to challenge its legitimacy in court. He will contend that this is a fraudulent marriage, designed solely to swindle him out of a legally acquired asset. The only thing my late husband swindled was a fair price for land, mister. Varn wanted to steal, Marin retorted, her voice cold as a winter morning. Fletcher's smile didn't falter. A jury may see it differently, Mrs. Hale, especially when they hear how a grieving widow so quickly found comfort in the arms of a local landholder. It paints a rather unflattering picture, one of calculation, of greed. The threat was clear. Varn would not fight them over the law. He would fight them over their character. He would drag their names through the mud until the entire town saw them as schemers. The lawyer tipped his hat and departed, leaving his poison to hang in the air. The whispers started the next day. In the general store, conversations would hush when Marin entered. At the saloon, men at Hattie Bloom's bar would mutter behind their hands about the fast widow and the land-hungry scout. They were Varn's words, planted and watered until they grew like weeds. The strain of the charade and the town's scrutiny settled over Jonah's small cabin. They were two strangers living under one roof, circling each other with a wary courtesy. Marin took over the small spare room, and they divided the chores with a practical efficiency that avoided the need for much conversation. One afternoon, seeking to break the suffocating tension, Jonah led her to the corral. Inside was a mare the color of charcoal dust, with a rebellious eye and a spirit to match. Her name is Ash. Jonah said, "She's stubborn, but she's smart. If you're going to live out here, you need to know how to ride properly, not side saddle like a town lady." The lessons were a battle of wills. Ash tested Marin at every turn, and Marin, frustrated and determined, refused to give in. Jonah instructed from the center of the corral, his voice calm and steady. "Don't pull so hard," he'd say. "You're fighting her. Feel the horse. Don't just command it. Let her know you're the one in charge. But do it with your hands, not with your anger." Slowly, painstakingly, a change began. Marin learned to move with the horse, to anticipate its moods. Jonah saw a strength in her that went beyond her sharp mind. It was a deep, unyielding grit. She, in turn, saw a patience in him she hadn't expected. He wasn't just a stoic loner. He was a man who understood the language of silence and trust. The real trust, however, was forged not in the corral, but at the well. The pump handle was heavy, the work of drawing enough water for the horses and the household grueling. They fell into a rhythm, working together without words. He'd work the handle, his shoulders straining with the effort, and she would guide the buckets, her movements sure and steady. One evening, exhausted and splattered with mud, they rested on the edge of the trough as the setting sun bled across the sky. "It's harder than it looks," she said, rubbing her aching arms. "Most things worth having are," he replied, his gaze on the horizon. In that quiet moment, the roles they were playing for the town, the scheming widow, the greedy rancher, fell away. They were just two people, bound by a desperate pact, sharing the burden of a hard day's work. The line between the legal fiction of their marriage and the reality of their shared struggle began to blur. A fragile, unspoken partnership was taking root in the dusty soil of Lone Mesa, a partnership that felt more real than the marriage certificate locked away in a tin box. It was a bond built not on vows spoken before a preacher, but on the shared weight of a water bucket and the quiet understanding of a stubborn horse. And in the harsh light of the frontier, that was a foundation far harder to break. The fragile truce with the land and the town was broken by the wind. It came from the east, a hot, dry breath that old-timers called a Santa Ana. It rattled the windows in Jonah's cabin, scoured the paint from the church steeple, and kicked the red dust into a frenzy. The air grew thin and electric, charged with a tension that made the horses skittish in the corral and put a flinty edge on every man's temper. For 3 days it blew, sucking the moisture from the very planks of the buildings, turning the valley into a tinderbox waiting for a spark. The spark came on the third night. Eli, A wiry orphan of about 12 who slept in the tack room in exchange for mucking out stalls and tending to the horses, was awakened by the smell. It wasn't the familiar scent of hay and manure. It was sharp, acrid, and hungry. He sat up on his cot, his heart starting a frantic drumbeat against his ribs. A strange, orange light flickered through the cracks in the barn wall. He scrambled to the door and peered out. The hayrick at the far end of the barn was a roaring pillar of flame, the wind whipping it into a fury, sending embers skittering across the dry ground like malevolent sprites. He didn't scream. Fear stole his voice. He just ran, his bare feet flying over the hard-packed earth toward Jonah's cabin, his mind filled with the terrifying image of the flames licking at the stalls where the horses were trapped. Jonah was awake the second the boy's small fists hammered on his door. He was out of bed before Eli's panicked shouts of fire fully registered. He pulled on his boots and trousers, his mind instantly clear and focused. This was no accident, not with this wind. Maren was already in the main room when he emerged, her face pale in the moonlight, a heavy wool blanket clutched in her hands. Fear was in her eyes, but beneath it was the same steely resolve he'd come to recognize. "The horses," was all he said, and she nodded, her expression grim. The scene at the barn was a vision of chaos. The fire was spreading with terrifying speed, the wind-driven flames consuming the dry timber of the barn. The terrified whinnies of the horses inside were a sound that tore at the soul. Jonah took command, the instincts of the cavalry scout overriding the quiet homesteader. "Eli, get the well pump going. Wet down sacks. Anything you can find, missus. Hail Maren, I need you to open the far corral gate. When I bring them out, don't let them bolt for the hills." He grabbed a bucket of water Eli had managed to draw and doused his own shirt and a bandana, tying the wet cloth over his face. He took a deep breath of the cleaner air near the ground and plunged into the smoke-filled barn. Heat blasted him, a physical force. Through the swirling blackness, he could see the terrified eyes of the horses, rolling in their stalls. He worked methodically, his voice a low, calming rumble as he unlatched the gates, slapping the animals' rumps to drive them toward the far entrance, away from the worst of the flames. Ash, Maren's stubborn mare, was wild with terror, kicking at the walls of her stall. He spoke her name, his voice firm but gentle, and managed to get a rope around her neck, leading the trembling animal out into the relative safety of the night. Outside, a small crowd had gathered. News of fire traveled faster than the flames in a small town. Men arrived with buckets, forming a chain from the well. Doc Ellery Finch, a man whose weary face had seen every kind of misery the frontier could offer, was there, his medical bag in hand, directing people to stay clear of the collapsing roof. Even Hattie Bloom, the saloon owner, was there, her usual silk dress traded for a practical skirt, her sleeves rolled up as she helped pass buckets. They were not fighting the fire to save Jonah Hale's barn. They were fighting it to stop it from consuming the entire valley. Maren worked with a desperate, focused energy. She stood her ground at the open gate, her voice calling to the panicked horses, using the same calm tones Jonah had taught her. She and Eli managed to guide the terrified animals into the far pasture as Jonah brought them out one by one. It took nearly an hour, an eternity of smoke, sweat, and blistering heat. But they saved the horses. The barn, however, was a lost cause. They could only stand back and watch as the roof finally gave way in a shower of sparks and collapsing beams, leaving a blackened, smoldering skeleton against the night sky. As dawn broke, casting a sickly gray light over the scene, a grim silence fell over the small group of neighbors. Doc Finch was tending to a burn on Jonah's forearm, his touch gentle and efficient. "You were lucky, son," the doctor said, his voice gravelly with exhaustion and smoke. "An hour more, and you'd have lost every animal you own." Jonah barely heard him. His eyes were scanning the faces of the men who had come to help, then moving to the smoldering ruins. This was a message from Silas Varn, written in ash and charcoal. It said, "You have nothing I cannot take. They spent the morning sifting through the wreckage. The smell of wet, burnt hay was overwhelming. It was Marin who found it, buried in the ashes near where the tack room had been. Half melted from the intense heat was a small, circular piece of metal. "Jonah, look at this," she said, her voice low. He took the object from her soot-covered palm. It was warped and blackened, but he could still make out the faint, raised lettering of an official seal. It wasn't the kind of lock one would use on a personal trunk. It was a geodetic survey seal, the kind a federal land registrar would use on official documents. They looked at each other, the same conclusion dawning on them both. "This seal wasn't on my trunk when I packed it in St. Louis," Marin said, her mind working quickly. "My trunk was locked with a simple brass padlock. This looks official. Which means someone with access to this kind of seal opened your trunk before it ever got to Colt," Jonah finished, the pieces clicking into place with a grim certainty. The robbery on the road wasn't just a robbery. It was the final step in a more complex deception. Someone hadn't just stolen her papers. They had replaced them with something else, something useless, and then staged a theft to cover their tracks. The fire was meant to destroy any evidence they might have missed, like a dropped, forgotten seal. "A corrupt official," Marin whispered, the scope of the conspiracy widening before them. Varn didn't just hire thugs. He bought the law itself. A few days later, nature sent its own assault. The wind shifted, and the sky turned a bruised, yellowish brown. A dust storm rolled in, a solid wall of dirt that blotted out the sun and turned midday into a suffocating twilight. They took shelter in the cabin, stuffing rags into the cracks around the windows and doors. But the fine dust still found its way in, coating every surface in a gritty film. The wind howled like a banshee, punctuated by the sharp crack of debris striking the roof. When the storm finally passed after several hours, they emerged to find the small chicken coop Jonah had built flattened, its splintered boards scattered across the yard. The world felt scoured, raw and hostile. Man and nature, it seemed, were allied against them. Trapped inside during the worst of the storm, the tension between them had returned. They were allies, but still strangers forced into an intimacy neither had sought. To break the oppressive silence, Jonah took out a small, worn piece of leather. "In the cavalry," he began, his voice quiet against the roar of the wind. "We couldn't always talk. A spoken word could carry for miles. Give away your position." He began to move his hands, his fingers forming sharp, precise shapes. "This means enemy sighted. This, water ahead. This one, danger." Marin watched, fascinated. It was a silent, secret language. "Teach me," she said. He showed her the basic signals, guiding her hands, correcting her form. Their fingers brushed. A brief, warm contact in the cool, dusty air of the cabin. It was an exercise in pure function, yet it felt intensely personal. He then explained how to watch a person's mouth, how the shapes of words were often the same even if you couldn't hear them. "You're a teacher," he said. "You know about letters. Sounds, just watch the mouth. You won't get every word, but you'll get the meaning." They practiced, mouthing words to each other across the small room as the storm raged outside. It became a quiet game, a way to communicate under the suffocating presence of the wind. And they both knew it could be a way to communicate under the watchful eyes of Varn's men. That evening, Marin rode Ash into town. The mare, seemingly respectful of the woman who had helped save her from the fire, was more compliant now. Marin's destination was Hattie's saloon. She knew a direct question would be met with suspicion, but Hattie Bloom saw and heard everything. Marin sat at a small table, nursing a glass of sarsaparilla, and simply listened. She heard two railroad men complaining about their pay, a rancher lamenting the price of beef, and then a snippet of conversation from two of Baxter Colt's men at the bar. "Heard the registrar fella from Silver Creek came into some money," one said, his voice slurred with whiskey. "Paid off his whole tab and bought a new horse. Said he had a lucky turn at cards." Hattie, polishing a glass behind the bar, caught Marin's eye for a split second. A barely perceptible nod was exchanged. It was all the confirmation Marin needed. She rode back to the cabin under a sky washed clean by the storm. The stars brilliant and cold. She had another piece of the puzzle, a burnt seal, a whispered rumor about a land registrar, and a new, silent way to speak. But it wasn't enough. They were fragments, clues in a language of corruption they were only just beginning to understand. They were fighting a ghost who owned the law, the guns, and now, it seemed, even the fire. The path ahead was dark, and the few glimmers of light they had found only served to show how deep the shadows truly were. The whispers planted by Silas Varne's lawyer had taken root in the dry, anxious soil of Lone Mesa. Doubt was a weed, and it grew well in the hearts of people who feared losing what little they had. To exploit this fear, Varne played his masterstroke. He announced, through notices posted outside the general store and Hattie's saloon, that he was sponsoring a community hearing to resolve the dispute over Cottonwood Spring once and for all. He was even bringing in a traveling circuit judge, a supposedly impartial arbiter named Judge Elias Thorne, to ensure everything was handled fairly and legally. To many of the homesteaders, worn down by the drought and the railroad's relentless pressure, this sounded like a reprieve, a chance to be heard. But to Jonah and Marin, it smelled like a trap. "He's building a stage," Jonah said, his voice low as they stood reading the notice. "And he's already written the final act." "He's making it look like the town is choosing to give him the water," Marin added. Her eyes narrowed. "He's not just stealing the spring. He's making the community an accomplice to the theft." Their sense of dread was confirmed the following Sunday. They sat in a back pew of the small wooden church, a place that now felt tainted by the memory of their hollow wedding vows. Reverend Abner Pike took the pulpit, his face scrubbed clean and pious, but his eyes held a new, feverish gleam. He did not speak of forgiveness or faith. He spoke of progress. "The Lord works in mysterious ways," he began, his voice resonating through the nave. "And I tell you now, he has sent a great instrument of his will to our humble valley, a railroad." He spread his arms wide, a showman in clerical robes. "It is a vessel of prosperity, a conduit for a new era. But this great work requires sustenance. It requires water. Some among us cling to the past, to old parchments and selfish claims, holding back the tide of God's plan for a greater Lone Mesa." Jonah's hands clenched into fists in his lap. He could feel Marin go rigid beside him. The Reverend's gaze seemed to sweep over them, though he never mentioned them by name. "I have prayed on this, and I have been blessed with a vision. A new church, a steeple that reaches to the heavens, built with the tithes of a prosperous community. Mr. Silas Varne has personally pledged a most generous donation to this holy fund, a testament to his commitment to our spiritual future." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Let us not be stumbling blocks on the path of righteousness. Let us release our claim on the worldly water, and in return, drink from the eternal wellspring of a blessed future." The betrayal was so brazen, so complete, it left Marin breathless. Pike was not just bought, he was an enthusiastic salesman for their ruin. He was using God as a cudgel to beat the homesteaders into submission. As the final hymn was sung, several members of the congregation cast wary, resentful glances toward Jonah and Marin. The trap had been sprung. That afternoon, they went to the only person they felt they could trust. Deputy Ruth Navarro was cleaning her pistol in the sheriff's office, the scent of gun oil sharp in the small, cluttered room. She listened to their story without interruption, her dark eyes fixed on them, weighing every word. She heard about the burnt seal, the rumor of the paid-off registrar, and now, the Reverend's sermon for sale. "Pike always did care more about the size of his steeple than the souls of his flock," she said, snapping the cylinder of her Colt back into place with a decisive click. "And Judge Thorne, I've heard of him. He follows the railroad like a coyote follows a wounded deer. She stood up and walked to a large map of the county pinned to the wall. The registrar at Silver Creek, a man named Thompson, was a railroad surveyor before he got his official post. If he swapped your documents, he'd need the original survey logs to make the forgery look right. Her finger traced the path of the main railroad line, then deviated, following a faint, dotted line that snaked up into the canyons of the San Mateo Mountains. This was the first spur they planned, before they found an easier grade to the north. They had a survey camp up in Diablo Canyon for a few months. When they abandoned the route, they left everything behind in a hurry. She turned to face them, her expression hard. It's a long shot, but if that logbook still exists, it's probably there. The journey was a secret one, undertaken at dawn the next day. The three of them rode north, keeping to the arroyos and low ground to avoid being seen. The abandoned tracks were like a ghost road, half swallowed by sand and sagebrush. They led into the narrow mouth of Diablo Canyon, where the temperature dropped and the rock walls rose up on either side, blotting out the sun. The camp was just as Ruth had described it. 2 canvas tents, now shredded and weather-beaten, and a small wooden shack, its door hanging from a single hinge. A profound silence hung over the place, the silence of abandonment. Inside the shack, they found a world of dust and decay. Surveying equipment rusted in a corner, and maps, nibbled by mice, were scattered across a crude table. "Look for a ledger," Marin said, her voice hushed, bound in black leather. They searched for nearly an hour. Jonah, sifting through a pile of rotten canvas, found it at the bottom of a wooden crate. The black leather was cracked and faded, but the surveyor's logbook was intact. Marin's hands trembled slightly as she opened it. She ran her finger down the dated entries, her lips moving silently. Then she stopped. "Here," she whispered, her voice tight with excitement. "June 12th, 1887, confirmed primary source of Cottonwood Creek at Springhead located at coordinates." She looked up at Jonah, her eyes shining. "The coordinates match the location my husband marked on his deed. The survey explicitly ties the spring to this parcel of land. It was the proof they needed, an official, unimpeachable record that predated Varn's entire operation." Jonah took the book, a grim satisfaction settling in him. "This is good, but it's not enough to prove fraud." As if in answer, Ruth, who had been searching a small lockbox, let out a low whistle. "Well, looks like Mr. Thompson wasn't just a bad card player, he was a bad bookkeeper." She held up a small, slim receipt book. Inside, written in a cramped, precise hand, were a series of entries. Payment to B. Colt for retrieval of documents. Payment to B. Colt for persuasion. Each entry was followed by a date and a dollar amount. It was a clear, damning ledger of Baxter Colt's dirty work, paid for by the railroad's chief surveyor. They had it all. The proof of Marin's claim and the proof of the conspiracy to hide it. The ride back should have been triumphant, but the canyon felt different now. The shadows seemed deeper, the silence more menacing. They were no longer searching for something. They were carrying it, and they were not the only ones who knew it. As they emerged from the canyon into a wide valley dotted with saguaro cacti, the first shot rang out. The sound cracked through the air, and a chip of rock exploded from a boulder just inches from Jonah's head. "Ambush," he yelled, years of instinct taking over. "Get down!" He spurred Calico forward, seeking the cover of a rocky outcropping, pushing Marin's horse. Ash, ahead of him. Ruth wheeled her mount, her pistol already drawn, firing back in the direction of the muzzle flash from a high ridge. Baxter Colt and 3 of his men were positioned above them, pinning them down. Another shot whizzed past Jonah's ear. He drew his own pistol, an old cavalry Schofield, and returned fire. They were outgunned and exposed. "We have to move," he shouted to Marin over the gunfire. "Follow me. Stay low." He broke cover, firing 2 quick shots to make the ambushers duck their heads. He galloped toward a narrow wash on the far side of the valley, the only viable escape route. Marin and Ruth followed close behind. A bullet tore through the sleeve of Jonah's shirt. Another struck the ground, kicking up a spray of dirt. Then came the searing, white-hot pain. It was a familiar agony. The bullet slammed into his left shoulder, the same shoulder that held the old cavalry wound. The impact was like being hit by a sledgehammer, knocking him forward in the saddle. His vision blurred, and his arm went numb, the Schofield falling from his useless fingers. Jonah Marin's scream cut through his haze of pain. He slumped against Calico's neck, fighting to stay conscious. Colt and his men, seeing him hit, began to ride down from the ridge, closing in for the kill. Ruth was firing methodically, trying to hold them back, but it was 3 against 1. Marin looked at Jonah, at the dark stain spreading across his shirt, at the agony on his face. She looked at the men bearing down on them, their faces cruel and determined. The educated teacher from St. Louis, the woman who believed in laws and ledgers, disappeared. In her place was a woman forged by fire and dust, a woman fighting for the life of the man who had become her partner. Jonah's fallen Schofield lay in the dirt. Without a second thought, she swung down from Ash, scooped up the heavy pistol, and remounted. The gun felt alien in her hands, a brutal piece of machinery. She had never fired a weapon in her life. She raised it with both hands, her arms trembling. She didn't aim for a man. She aimed for the rock face just above Baxter Colt's head. She squeezed the trigger. The explosion was deafening, the recoil jarring her to the bone. The bullet shrieked off the rock, sending a shower of stone fragments down on the riders. Their horses panicked at the unexpected shot from a new direction. Colt's horse reared, throwing him to the ground. It was the opening they needed. Now Ruth yelled, and they spurred their horses, galloping hard down the wash as Colt's men scrambled to regain control. They rode until the sounds of pursuit faded, until the valley of cacti was far behind them. Only then did Marin dare to look back. Jonah was still in the saddle, but just barely, his body swaying with the motion of the horse. "We have to stop," she said, her voice shaking. "He's losing too much blood." As if on cue, the sky, which had been a clear, harsh blue, began to fill with bruised-looking clouds rolling in from the north. The wind picked up, carrying the cold scent of rain, or something worse. A storm was coming. Jonah looked at her, his face pale and beaded with sweat, but his eyes were clear. "There's an old line cabin," he managed to say, his voice a hoarse whisper. "In the foothills. We have to get there before the storm hits." He was leaning heavily on her now, and with every step the horses took, she could feel the life seeping out of him. They were wounded, hunted, with a storm bearing down on them and a book full of dynamite for evidence. The tension that had been tightening for weeks had finally snapped, leaving them in the most dangerous position of their lives. The world had shrunk to the space between one ragged breath and the next. Jonah was a dead weight against Marin's side, his consciousness flickering like a dying candle flame. The wind, no longer hot and dry, had turned bitingly cold, driving needles of sleet that quickly thickened into wet, heavy snow. It was a freak storm, a cruel caprice of the high desert mountains, and it was going to kill them if they didn't find shelter. "Just a little further. Jonah," Marin pleaded, her words snatched away by the wind. Her own body ached with a deep, bone-weary exhaustion, but she pushed on, guiding the 2 horses through the blinding snow, following the vague directions he had given her before the pain had overwhelmed him. Just as she felt her last reserves of strength failing, she saw it through the swirling white, a dark shape against the snow, a low, solid outline. The cabin. It was a crude, one-room structure, built by long-gone loggers, its roof sagging under the weight of previous winters. To Marin, it was the most beautiful sight she had ever seen. Getting him off the horse and inside was a brutal, clumsy ordeal. He was barely able to stand, his legs buckling beneath him. She half dragged, half carried his weight, her muscles screaming in protest, until they stumbled through the doorway and collapsed onto the dusty floorboards. The wind howled, slamming the door shut behind them, plunging the small space into a profound, echoing silence. For a moment, she just lay there, gasping for air, the scent of old pine and cold stone filling her lungs. Then, the urgency returned. Jonah was shivering violently, his teeth chattering. She scrambled to her feet, her movements stiff. She managed to get the horses into a small lean-to attached to the cabin, pulling off their saddles with frozen fingers. Inside, her first priority was fire. Thankfully, the previous occupants had left a small stack of firewood next to the stone hearth. With trembling hands, she used the flint and steel from Jonah's saddlebag, her frustration mounting with every failed spark until, finally, a small flame caught in the tinder and grew into a life-giving blaze. As warmth began to seep into the frigid air, she turned her attention to Jonah. In the flickering firelight, his face was waxy and pale, except for 2 feverish spots of red high on his cheekbones. His shirt was stiff with frozen blood. She knew, with a certainty that terrified her, that if she didn't clean the wound, the fever would consume him. Steeling herself, she gently cut the fabric away with his knife. The wound was angry and inflamed, the bullet having torn through the old scar tissue. In a small cupboard, she found a half-empty bottle of whiskey and a few clean-looking rags. Tearing a strip from her own petticoat, she whispered, "I'm sorry. Jonah, this is going to hurt." She poured the raw spirits onto the wound. He cried out, a strangled, guttural sound, and arched his back in agony, even in his delirium. She flinched, tears springing to her eyes, but her hands remained steady as she cleaned the wound as best she could, her touch firm but gentle. She packed the wound with the clean rags and bound it tightly with a strip of her petticoat. The fever did not abate. As the night wore on and the snow piled deeper outside, Jonah drifted into a restless, tormented sleep. He muttered names she didn't know men from his cavalry days, perhaps, and spoke of fire and cold. He was lost in the landscape of his own past, and she was the sole witness to his vulnerability. She saw not the stoic, capable man who had saved her on the road, but a man haunted by a life of hardship, a man who had been wounded long before Baxter Colt's bullet had found him. She kept the fire roaring, melting snow in a rusty pot for him to drink, forcing a few sips between his parched lips whenever he grew still. In a dusty corner, she found a heavy, stiff deerskin blanket. She draped it over him, trying to conserve every bit of warmth, but still, he shivered, his body fighting a battle she could not see. Sometime after midnight, a profound quiet settled over the world. The storm had passed, leaving behind a silent, transformed landscape. The only sound in the cabin was the soft crackle and pop of the logs in the hearth. Jonah's shivering subsided. His breathing deepened, becoming more regular. Marin placed a hand on his forehead. The fire of the fever had burned down to embers. He was cool to the touch. He stirred, and his eyes fluttered open. They were no longer glazed and distant, but clear and present. He looked at her, his gaze taking in her exhausted, soot-smudged face, the makeshift bandage on his shoulder, the firelight glinting in her weary eyes. "Marin," he rasped, his voice rough from disuse. "I'm here," she whispered, her voice thick with relief. You saved my life," he said, the words a simple statement of fact, yet they held the weight of a profound debt. "We saved each other," she answered, smoothing a stray lock of hair from his forehead. He looked around the small cabin, at the snow-covered world visible through the single small window, and then back at her. The barriers they had so carefully maintained, the formal address, the physical distance. The pretense of their arrangement seemed to have been burned away by the fever and buried by the snow. In this small, isolated space, they were no longer the teacher and the scout, the partners in a legal scheme. They were just a man and a woman who had fought for each other, who had faced death together and survived. He shivered again. A deep, bone-chilling tremor that had nothing to do with the fever. It was the cold, seeping back into him now that the fever's fire was gone. Marin knew, with a primal instinct, what she had to do. They needed warmth, a shared warmth that no fire or blanket could provide on its own. She lay down on the narrow bunk beside him, pulling the heavy deerskin over them both. She was careful not to jostle his wounded shoulder. He turned his head on the rolled-up saddle he was using as a pillow, his breath warm against her cheek. They lay in silence for a long time, listening to the fire and the beating of their own hearts. The pretense was over. The marriage certificate signed in a dusty church was a pale imitation of the bond forged in this cabin. This was real. Her decision was not one of desperation or necessity. It was a choice, born in the quiet of a snowbound night. She had seen the truth of him in his delirium, and he had seen the strength in her through his pain. This was no longer about a water claim or a legal strategy. It was about the man beside her, leaning in, so close that her lips brushed against the shell of his ear. She gave voice to the truth that had taken root in her heart. "Be my husband tonight," she murmured, the words a soft prayer in the stillness. He didn't answer with words. He didn't need to. He shifted his good arm from beneath the blanket and brought his hand to her face, his calloused, work-worn fingers, so strong and capable, traced the line of her jaw with an almost reverent gentleness. It was a touch that spoke of a lifetime of hardship, of battles fought and scars earned. It was a touch that knew how to hold the reins of a frightened horse, how to build a fence, how to aim a gun. And now, it was a touch that knew how to be tender. His hands told their secret, fierce yet tender in the cabin, fierce in the silent, desperate need for connection after a life of solitude, tender in the profound, unspoken gratitude for the woman who had saved him. It was a confirmation, a vow truer than any spoken before a preacher. It was the moment their marriage of convenience became a marriage of the heart, a bond not of law, but of choice and of healing. As the fire burned low, casting long shadows that danced on the rough-hewn walls, they shared their warmth. A quiet promise made in the heart of a winter storm, a sanctuary found in the middle of a war. Dawn broke over a world of impossible white. The storm had passed, leaving the foothills draped in a thick, silent blanket of snow. The beauty of it was sharp and treacherous. Every familiar landmark was gone, smoothed over and softened into a landscape that was both magical and deadly. Inside the cabin, the fire had dwindled to a bed of glowing embers, the warmth of the night, a warmth that had come from more than just the hearth, lingered under the deerskin blanket. Jonah was awake. The pain in his shoulder was a dull, heavy anchor, but his mind was clear. He watched Marin as she slept, her face peaceful in the pale morning light, and a feeling he had spent years holding at bay settled in his chest. It was not just gratitude. It was a fierce, protective instinct, a sense of belonging that he had thought was lost to him forever. Their marriage was no longer a contract. It was a covenant, sealed not with ink, but with shared blood, fear, and a whispered promise in the dark. But the world outside the cabin had not changed. Varn was still waiting. The hearing was today. "Marin," he said softly, "we have to go." Her eyes opened instantly, and for a moment, the memory of the night was there, a soft, vulnerable glow. Then, it was replaced by the same grim determination that had driven them this far. The journey back was a grueling ordeal. The snow was knee-deep on the horses, making every step a struggle. Jonah, weakened by his injury, had to grit his teeth against the jarring pain. Marin led the way, her focus absolute, navigating by the position of the sun and the faint outlines of ridges that Jonah pointed out. They were a single unit, moving with a shared purpose, They carried the heavy logbook and the damning receipt book wrapped in oilcloth, a fragile cargo that held the future of the entire valley. They reached the outskirts of Lone Mesa as the midday sun was reaching its zenith, melting the snow into a muddy, treacherous slush. The town was unnervingly quiet. Most of its citizens gathered at the makeshift platform that had been erected in the open space between the general store and the saloon. It looked like a gallows. As they rode down the main street, a few people turned to stare. They saw a man, pale and grim-faced, his arm in a crude sling, and a woman, her dress torn and mud-splattered, her expression as hard as flint. They did not look like schemers. They looked like survivors. At the edge of the crowd, Deputy Ruth Navarro met them. There were no wasted words. Her eyes took in Jonah's injury, the exhaustion on their faces, and she gave a single, sharp nod. "You're just in time for the main event," she said, her voice low. Behind her, scattered through the crowd, Marin could see the faces of the homesteaders Ruth had spoken to, the Garcias, the Millers, Old Man Peterson. They were not there as a mob. They were there as witnesses, their expressions wary but watchful. Ruth had quietly rallied them, not with promises, but with a simple question: "Don't you want to hear both sides?" On the platform, the tableau of false justice was complete. Judge Elias Thorne, a man with a florid face and eyes that were too small and too close together, sat behind a rough plank table. Silas Varn stood beside him, a picture of civic concern, dressed in a fine suit, and on the other side, looking deeply uncomfortable, was Reverend Abner Pike. Baxter Colt and his men were positioned at the corners of the platform, their hands resting on their pistol grips, their presence a clear message of intimidation. Judge Thorne banged a gavel on the table. This community hearing is now in session to resolve the public dispute over the water rights of Cottonwood Spring. Mr. Varn, as the petitioner for the public good, you may begin. Varn stepped forward, his voice smooth and reasonable. "My friends, my neighbors, I come to you not as a businessman, but as a partner in our shared future. The railroad is the key to that future, and like any great enterprise, it requires resources. This is not about ownership. It is about stewardship. I am asking the community to grant stewardship of the spring for the prosperity of all." He was met with a smattering of applause, mostly from his own men. "And what of the Calloway claim?" someone shouted from the crowd. Varn sighed. A mask of regret, a tragic situation. A claim based on what appears to be a fraudulent document, now being exploited by a desperate widow and an opportunistic man in a marriage of blatant convenience. A marriage, I might add, that seeks to rob this community of its very lifeblood. Before the judge could speak, Marin's voice, clear and strong, cut through the air. "That is a lie." She and Jonah began to walk through the crowd, which parted for them like the Red Sea. They stopped at the foot of the platform, the logbook and receipt book in Marin's hands. "This is no hearing," Marin declared, her eyes locked on Judge Thorne. "This is a public auction, and the only thing for sale is the law. You are not a judge. You are Mr. Varn's employee." Thorne's face purpled with fury. "You are out of order. Madam, you have no proof." "Oh, but we do," Marin said, holding up the surveyor's logbook. "This is the official geodetic survey log from 1887. It proves, unequivocally, that Cottonwood Spring originates on the parcel of land legally purchased by my late husband. The deed they stole from me was valid." She tossed the heavy book onto the platform. It landed with a solid, irrefutable thud. Varn's confident smile faltered for the first time. Jonah stepped forward, holding up the slim receipt book. "And this," he said, his voice a low growl, "is proof of the conspiracy to hide that fact." He looked directly at Baxter Colt, whose face had gone pale. "This is a record of payments made by the railroad's chief surveyor to 1B. Colt. Payments for retrieval of documents. Payments for persuasion. payments for setting a fire to destroy the evidence. A collective gasp went through the crowd. This was no longer about legal documents. It was about arson and assault. "These are lies, forgeries," Baxter Colt bellowed, his hand creeping toward his pistol. "Is it a lie that you paid a man named Jedediah Croft to watch Mrs. Calloway's trunk on the stagecoach from Silver Creek?" A new voice called out. Hattie Bloom stepped out from the crowd, a grim-faced man in tow. He was a railroad freight worker, his face a mixture of fear and resolve. "Jedediah here has something to say." The freight worker, his eyes on the ground, began to speak, his voice trembling. "It's true. Mr. Colt paid me, said it was railroad business. I saw the land registrar, Mr. Thompson, take the lady's trunk into his office. When it came out, it had a new seal on it. An official one." That was it. The final piece. The story was complete. From the corrupt official to the hired thug to the man on the platform pretending to be a civic leader. Baxter Colt, seeing the trap closing, seeing the faces of the homesteaders turn from suspicion to open hostility, broke. He was a man of violence, not of wits. He did the only thing he knew how to do. He drew his gun. He wasn't aiming for the witness. He was aiming for Marin. "No," Jonah roared. Everything slowed down. Jonah, with a speed born of pure instinct, lunged forward. Not at Colt, but at the crude wooden railing of the platform. He ripped a thick plank free just as Colt fired. He threw himself in front of Marin, holding the plank up like a shield. The heavy slug slammed into the wood with a sickening thud, the force of the impact staggering him. Splinters exploded into his face, but the thick plank held. In that same instant, a second shot cracked through the air. It was sharper, more precise. Deputy Ruth Navarro stood 10 feet away, her pistol smoking, her stance perfectly steady. Baxter Colt screamed, a high, thin sound, and dropped his gun, clutching his right hand. A dark red stain was already spreading through his fingers. He had been disarmed. Not killed. It was the work of a law officer, not an executioner. Chaos erupted. Colt's men, seeing their leader fall, hesitated, their eyes darting between Ruth's unwavering pistol and the now angry crowd of farmers. Silas Varn saw his empire of lies collapsing. His mask of civility dissolved, revealing the naked, desperate predator beneath. He didn't run for a horse. He ran for the railroad tracks, where a small, experimental steam engine, a powerful new model he was testing, sat idling, a plume of steam rising into the air. It was his escape route, his symbol of power. He scrambled into the cab and threw the throttle forward. With a lurch and a powerful hiss of steam, the engine began to move, picking up speed with terrifying swiftness. He was going to get away. But the land of Lone Mesa had one more card to play. The unseasonable snow, now melting rapidly under the midday sun, had saturated the loose, sandy soil of the embankment that ran alongside the tracks just outside of town. As the heavy engine thundered past, its weight and vibration were the last straw. With a low, groaning sound, the hillside gave way. A river of mud and sand cascaded down, not with the force of an avalanche, but with a thick, inexorable slowness. It flowed over the rails, a greasy tide of earth. The engine hit the slide at full speed. There was a horrifying screech of tortured metal as the wheels left the tracks. The massive machine, a monument to Varn's ambition, tilted, hung for a moment in a state of impossible balance, and then crashed onto its side with a thunderous roar. It slid for 20 yards in the mud, plowing a deep furrow in the earth before coming to a stop. A crippled beast of iron, hissing steam from a dozen ruptured pipes. A stunned silence fell over the town. The symbol of Varn's ruthless progress lay broken, defeated not by a gun, but by the very land he had sought to conquer. His technology, fueled by his greed, had been undone by a simple consequence of nature. The machine had betrayed its master. Jonah lowered the splintered plank. his shoulders screaming in protest. He looked at Marin, who was staring at the wreckage, her face a mask of shock and awe. He put his good arm around her, and she leaned into him. The long, terrible fight finally over. Ruth Navarro walked calmly toward the hissing engine, her handcuffs glinting in the sun, ready to arrest a man who had been brought down by a handful of dust and a river of mud. The colossal hiss of the dying engine was the first sound to break the spell. It was the sound of a great power being extinguished, leaving a vacuum in its wake. For a long moment, the people of Lone Mesa simply stared at the wreck, at the impossible sight of Silas Varne's iron beast lying crippled in a river of mud. Then, the world started moving again, slowly, deliberately. Deputy Ruth Navarro was the first. She handed her pistol to a stunned homesteader, her voice calm and clear. "Watch him," she said, nodding toward the whimpering Baxter colt, who was clutching his shattered hand. She then walked, not ran, toward the overturned engine, her steps sure in the slush and mud. Jonah felt Marin tremble in his arm, a delayed reaction to the violence and the terror. He held her tighter, his good hand a steady pressure on her back. He had shielded her from a bullet, but he knew, with a certainty that went bone deep, that she had been shielding him all along from his own solitude, from the ghosts of his past. Doc Ellery Finch was already moving, his bag in hand, his weary face a mask of professional duty. He went first to Jonah. "Let me see that, son," he said, gently taking the splintered plank from Jonah's grasp. He examined the fresh welts and cuts on his face and chest. Wood splinters are a nuisance, but better than lead. His eyes then went to Jonah's shoulder. "We'll need to get that cleaned properly. The bullet went clean through, but the ride back can't have done you any favors." From the wreck, they heard a muffled curse. Ruth emerged from the steam, dragging a dazed and mud-caked Silas Varne by the collar. The railroad baron's fine suit was ruined. His face was slack with disbelief. All the power, all the authority he had wielded just minutes before, had vanished. He was just a man, covered in the dirt he had tried to own. He offered no resistance as Ruth snapped the handcuffs around his wrists. He looked at the crowd, at the hard, unforgiving faces of the people he had tried to break, and for the first time, he seemed to understand that his money was worthless here. The aftermath unfolded not with the drama of the confrontation, but with the slow, methodical turning of legal and communal wheels. In the sheriff's small office, Baxter Colt, his hand bandaged and his bravado shattered by pain, sang like a canary. He confessed everything. He told them about the land registrar in Silver Creek, about the staged robbery, about the arson at Jonah's barn, and, his voice dropping, he told them how Reverend Abner Pike had approached him weeks ago, asking what gestures of support from the railroad might be available for a man of God with a vision for a new church. It was a sordid, pathetic tale of greed and weakness, and Ruth Navarro wrote it all down, every last word. With Colt's confession and the surveyor's logbook, the legal case was ironclad. Judge Thorne, now desperate to distance himself from the disaster, held a brief formal session in the saloon, the closest thing to a neutral hall of justice the town had. He declared the community hearing null and void. He reviewed the logbook and the original land patents Marin's husband had filed. With a trembling hand, he affixed his official seal to a new, clean certificate of title, legally affirming Marin Calloway Hale's undisputed ownership of the land and water rights pertaining to Cottonwood Spring. He pushed the document across the table to Marin. She picked it up, her fingers tracing the embossed seal. It was just a piece of paper, but it felt as heavy as a gravestone and as light as a feather. It was the end of one journey and the beginning of another. She looked across the table at Jonah, who stood beside her, his arm now properly cleaned and bandaged in a sling. She didn't smile. She didn't need to. He saw the victory in her eyes, and it was his too. But justice for one was not justice for all. The deepest wound in Lone Mesa was not the legal chicanery. It was the breach of faith, and that wound could only be addressed at its source. 3 days later, on a clear, cool morning, the congregation gathered not inside the church, but in the muddy yard in front of it. They came not for a sermon, but for an accounting. Reverend Abner Pike stood on the top step, his Bible held in his hands. Though he never opened it, he wore his simple black robes, but they no longer seemed to grant him any authority. He looked small and broken. He began to speak, his voice devoid of its usual booming rhetoric. It was quiet, strained, and raw with shame. "I stood before you in God's house and I spoke of progress," he said, his eyes scanning the faces of his flock, the men and women he had christened, married, and buried. "I spoke of a new steeple, of a prosperous future. I allowed my vanity, my desire for a grander church, to blind me to the truth. I wrapped Mr. Varn's greed in the cloth of God's will, and for that, I have sinned. I have sinned against this community, and I have sinned against my own faith." He looked directly at Marin and Jonah. "I took money that was meant to purchase your silence and your submission. I betrayed the trust you placed in me, not just as a minister, but as a neighbor." His voice cracked. "I ask for your forgiveness, though I know I have not earned it." He did not offer excuses. He did not ask for pity. He simply stood there, having laid his soul bare, and accepted their judgment. There was no immediate response, only a long, heavy silence. Then, one of the homesteaders, Mrs. Garcia, a woman whose family had been on the brink of ruin, stepped forward and simply nodded. It was not forgiveness, not yet, but it was the beginning of it. The healing of Lone Mesa had begun. In the following weeks, the town began to remake itself. The first order of business was the water. Marin, now the legal owner of the spring, called a meeting not of lawyers, but of all the small ranchers and farmers in the valley. They gathered at Hattie's saloon. The tables pushed together to form a council. "This spring was never meant to belong to just one person," Marin said. Standing before them, Jonah at her side, "It's the life of this valley. We're not going to replace one tyrant with another." They spent the entire day talking, arguing, and finally, agreeing. They drew up a charter, a simple document that established the Cottonwood Water Cooperative. Every family would be allotted a fair share, with provisions for drought and future growth. They created a council to manage it, and in a unanimous vote, they elected Deputy Ruth Navarro as the impartial supervisor, the one person everyone trusted to enforce the rules without fear or favor. The change in the town was palpable, but the most profound changes were happening at Jonah's cabin. He and Marin, with help from Eli and a few neighbors, began the slow work of rebuilding the barn. The acrid smell of burnt timber was replaced by the clean, sharp scent of fresh sawn pine. The rhythmic sound of their hammers became a new kind of heartbeat for the small homestead. One evening, as the sun set, painting the sky in the same fiery colors as the night of the fire, they stood back to admire their work. The new frame was strong, the lines true. "I spent a lot of years thinking about heading further west," Jonah said, his voice quiet. He looked out at the vast, open land stretching toward the horizon. "Always thought there was a place with fewer people, fewer problems. A place I could finally be left alone." He turned to look at her, and the setting sun caught the warmth in his eyes. "I stopped looking for that place a while ago. I think this is as far west as I need to go." He had found his peace not in solitude, but in connection. He had accepted his place, not just in the geography of Lone Mesa, but in the landscape of a shared life. Marin felt her heart swell. She had come to Lone Mesa seeking to reclaim her past, her husband's legacy. But in the fire and the snow, in the fight for justice, she had found her future. "Good," she said softly, "because I have an idea." A few days later, she stood before the new water council. "We fought this battle with deeds and logbooks," she said, "but we almost lost because most of us didn't know what our rights were. We were fighting in the dark. Knowledge is as vital as water. She unrolled a rough sketch on the table. It was a plan for a small building. I want to build a school, not just for the children, to teach them reading and sums. I want to hold classes for adults, for anyone who wants to learn. I want to teach people how to read a contract, how to understand a land deed. I want to teach basic law, so that no one in this valley can ever be intimidated by a man in a fancy suit quoting statutes they don't understand, especially the women and the new families moving in. It was a revolutionary idea. It was a declaration that the future of Lone Mesa would be built not just on shared water, but on shared knowledge. It was Marin's final transformation, from a woman defending her inheritance to a leader building her community's foundation. The healing was no longer about mending what was broken. It was about building something stronger than what had existed before. The rains came in late autumn, not as a violent torrent, but as a gentle, persistent soaking that the old-timers had almost forgotten was possible. For days, a soft gray curtain hung over the valley, and the red dust, the tyrant of Lone Mesa, was finally tamed, turning into a rich, dark soil that smelled of life and possibility. The water trickled down from the mesas, gathering in the arroyos, and flowed into Cottonwood Creek. The spring, the heart of their conflict, ran full and clear, its surface mirroring the newly washed sky. It was a baptism for the land, and for its people. With the return of the water came the return of life, and with it, the desire for celebration. The first wedding of Jonah and Marin Hale had been a secret, a hushed and desperate legal maneuver. Their second was a public declaration. They chose to hold it not in the church, with its complicated memories, but on the banks of Cottonwood Creek, under the broad, sheltering branches of the ancient cottonwood tree that gave the spring its name. The entire town was there. It was not a gathering of suspicious spectators, but of friends and partners. The Garcias brought freshly baked bread. Hattie Bloom provided 2 barrels of her best beer, and a young man from the railroad crew, who had once worked for Varn but now stayed on for a fair wage, played a lively tune on his fiddle. Reverend Abner Pike officiated. At their request, he did not stand on a raised platform, but on the same ground as everyone else. His voice was no longer the booming instrument of a showman, but the quiet, humble voice of a man who had faced his own failings and found a measure of grace. He kept his words simple. "We are gathered here today not to join 2 people, but to recognize a union that has already been forged," he said, his eyes meeting Jonah's, then Marin's. It was forged in adversity, tested by fire, and sealed by a courage that has reminded all of us what it means to be a community. The vows you make today are not the beginning of your story, but a celebration of it. Jonah and Marin faced each other. He was not wearing a formal suit, but his best clean shirt, his injured arm resting in a new leather sling Marin had fashioned for him. She wore a simple dress of deep blue, the same color she had worn the day she arrived. But today it was not the color of a grieving widow, but the color of a twilight sky full of promise. Jonah took her hand in his good one. "Marin," he began, his voice rough with an emotion he made no effort to hide. "I was a man who believed his life was over. I was just waiting for the end. You walked into my life, and you didn't just ask me to stand up for you. You made me want to stand up for myself. You are the truest, strongest person I have ever known. My home is wherever you are." Tears welled in Marin's eyes, but her voice was steady when she spoke. "Jonah, I came here seeking justice for the past. I was alone, and I thought I had to be strong enough to fight the whole world by myself. You taught me that true strength isn't about standing alone. It's about standing together. You stood with me when you had every reason to walk away. You are a good and honorable man. Jonah Hale. My heart is wherever you are." They exchanged no rings. Their bond needed no symbol. When the Reverend pronounced them man and wife, for the second and final time, Jonah leaned in and kissed her, a tender, public affirmation of the promise that had been whispered in the dark of a snowbound cabin. The cheers of the townspeople echoed across the valley. a joyful sound that mingled with the gurgle of the spring and the rustle of the cottonwood leaves. In the months that followed, the new barn at Jonah's homestead was completed, stronger than the first. But it was not the only new building in the valley. Using funds from the new water cooperative and lumber donated by the very homesteaders whose futures were now secure, they built the school. It stood on a small rise overlooking the spring, a simple but sturdy structure with large windows to let in the light. The day they finished it, Jonah and Eli hung the sign Marin had carefully painted. It was a plain wooden plank, and the words were simple, but they were the new creed of Lone Mesa. Water is life shared fairly. Below it, in smaller letters, it read, "The Lone Mesa Community School. All are welcome." Children came to learn their letters, but as Marin had promised, adults came too, twice a week in the evenings. She held her law and literacy classes. She saw ranchers who had worked the land their whole lives puzzling out the dense language of a seed contract. She saw their wives, their hands rough from a lifetime of hard labor, painstakingly learning to write their own names, their faces glowing with a fierce pride. It was slow, patient work, the building of a community's mind and will, and it was the most important work she had ever done. One evening, after the first proper rain of the new season had passed, Marin and Jonah stood on the porch of their cabin. The air was cool and clean, and the scent of wet sagebrush was a kind of perfume. The fiddle music from a small dance being held near the new schoolhouse drifted up to them on the breeze. "It's a good sound," Jonah said, listening to the laughter. "It is," Marin agreed. She held out her hand. "Will you dance with your wife, Mr. Hale?" He smiled, a slow, genuine smile that reached his eyes. He took her hand, and they stepped down from the porch onto the damp, dark, red earth. There, under a canopy of stars, they began to move, a slow, swaying dance without music, their steps perfectly in sync. She rested her head against his chest, right over his heart. Her hand came to rest on his wounded shoulder, the one that bore both the old scar and the new one. He flinched, almost imperceptibly, a phantom memory of pain. "Does it still hurt?" she asked softly. He placed his good hand over hers, holding it there against the scarred tissue. "No," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Not anymore." He looked down at his hand covering hers. It was a big, calloused hand, the hand of a man who had known violence and hardship. The knuckles were scarred, the fingers thick from years of hard work. He thought of all the things that hand had done: held a rifle, pulled a trigger, thrown a punch. It had been a tool of survival in a harsh world. But now, it rested gently over his wife's, a gesture of pure tenderness. He had not changed who he was. He had simply become more of himself. The hands that had once been so fierce with the world had finally learned how to be gentle. They danced in silence for a while longer. Two people who had found their home not on a map, but in each other. The next week, the stagecoach rattled into town, bringing the mail. Eli, who now spent more time at the Hale cabin than anywhere else, ran out to collect it. Among the usual circulars and a letter from a seed company, there was a thick envelope addressed to Mrs. Marin Calloway Hale, the Lone Mesa School. She opened it that evening by the light of the oil lamp. Jonah sat across from her, repairing a piece of tack, the familiar, comforting scent of leather filling the small room. As she read, a deep line of concentration formed between her brows. "What is it?" Jonah asked, noticing her stillness. She looked up from the page, her expression a mixture of weariness and resolve. "It's from a town, 2 days' ride south, a place called Verde Creek." She paused, then continued, reading from the letter. "We have heard of the cooperative you established. Our situation is much the same. A large cattle consortium is attempting to dam our creek, and they have the law and the politicians in their pocket. Our farms are drying up. We are writing to ask if you would be willing to advise us, to teach us how you fought back." She put the letter down on the table between them. The paper seemed to glow in the lamplight. It was a call, an echo of her own journey. The fight was not over. It had just moved to a new valley. Jonah stopped his work. He looked at the letter, then at his wife. He saw the fire in her eyes, the same fire he had seen the day he'd met her on the road. He knew what she was going to say before she said it, and he knew what his answer would be. The quiet life he had once craved seemed like a pale and lonely thing now. Their life was here, together, and their work, it seemed, was just beginning. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We'd love to know where you're listening from, so please drop a comment below to say hello and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed our tale, we invite you to subscribe to our channel, Wild West Night. Give this video a like, and support us further by hitting the hype button so this story can be heard by many more.